We're starting Getting to Yes, Chapter 2. When the authors discuss giving us a different way to approach negotiations and dispute resolution, they start by telling us to separate people from the problem, and most of us conflate those two issues. So separating out the problem from the people helps us engage in ways that are much more constructive. When you're dealing with people, you have to remember that people don't always have full information and make rational choices. We have cognitive biases about what we even perceive to be true. We have differences in the way we perceive the same information. We all think that we know what's true, but there's differences among us in what we even see in the first place, what we notice, and what values we put on that information and how we act on that information. We're separately going to be talking about the Myers-Briggs and what that reveals to us about the way that we perceive and act on information. But realize that we all have different perceptions about what's happened. Whenever there's a problem to be negotiated, realize that there may well be a misunderstanding. And so if you go in there saying, we're solving this, you may not be able to start at that point. You may need to go backwards and figure out what are we not understanding about our relative perceptions about what's wrong. When we get very much into the winning and losing approach towards negotiation, we focus more on how can I win against this person? How can I make a point? How can I prove I'm right and he's wrong? We tend to filter information so it confirms our previous biases. So we filter out, we put the worst possible assumption about what other people have. We naturally want to blame people. It's hard for most of us to look at the ways that we may have contributed to a misunderstanding. All of these factors taken together as just one big ugly stew make it harder to negotiate. When ongoing relationships become at risk, that makes solving problems even harder. And at the same time, when we don't have ongoing relationships, that can make it hard to negotiate. The authors talk about last inning behavior. What happens when you don't anticipate that you'll have any ongoing relationship with this other person? Many people engage in what's called this last inning behavior of, I don't care what happens to you, I'm trying to get the most for myself. So in a way, not having an idea that you will continue to have a relationship with someone makes it more difficult to reach a fair result. When egos become entangled, it's hard to separate that from the underlying problem to be resolved. And we tend to view our own assumptions about other people's behavior as factual in nature. And we are often defensive about what we are fearful that person is trying to do to us. So arguing over positions puts both the relationship at risk and also puts the underlying substantive negotiation at risk. So the authors of Getting to Yes encourage us to separate our relationship from the substance of what we are negotiating. Deal directly and kindly with people, but with the problem, negotiate that separately from how you feel about that person. They give us some guidance on the best way to do that. First off is to clear up what your mutual perceptions are. Don't assume that they're identical, they're probably not. Engage in clear two-way or multi-way communication. Don't assume that other people know what you think. Identify what you think. Don't assume that you're correctly interpreting what they're saying. Verify if you understand what they're saying. These are all potentially very neutral and calm conversations. You're allowed to have emotions. Oftentimes students will come to me and say, well, do you think I'm right in feeling X? Well, I don't know if you're right or wrong, but that's how you feel. Your feelings are neither right nor wrong. They're how you feel. Learn to express your emotions without any blame. And assume optimism. Problems can get solved. We all think our problems are bigger and more unsolvable than others. They're probably not. So start with the idea of, let's see what we can work out. The authors encourage us to deal with people by changing how you treat them. In other words, it doesn't mean you have to give up what it is you're hoping to get out of a negotiation. It does mean that you can change how you treat people, and that in itself will lead to improved outcomes. The authors encourage us to recognize that psychological problems can be dealt with using psychological techniques. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on this in our class, but the authors of Getting to Yes have a few suggestions up front. One is, you've made assumptions about the reality. Test those assumptions. Don't assume you're right all the time. Educate people. Educate them on what your assumption is. Educate yourself on what other people are viewing. Look at what people are saying or doing and put them in these various categories: what they perceive, the emotion they attach to that perception, and the way they're communicating about their perception. Those are actually all separate things. Your perception is one more way in which you can reach negotiation outcomes with someone else. We talked before a little bit about cognitive biases. One cognitive bias is affirmation. We tend to select the information that we perceive so it confirms what our presumption already was. We tend to misinterpret other information or just dismiss it as being unimportant or not even see it in the first place. So don't think you're above having cognitive biases. We all do. One good way that you can improve your understanding of what's happening is to understand someone else's perception. It doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with their perception, but find ways in which you can register to someone else that you understand what they're thinking. I have a friend who cannot hear the words "I'm sorry" without saying, well, it's not your fault. Sometimes "I'm sorry" might mean, well, I'm sorry that this happened. I'm sorry you got in a car accident. Doesn't mean I caused it. It means I'm sorry it happened. But he's so quick to reject that kind of information from someone else, he can't really hear the rest of it. This isn't the end of the world, but see what you can do about non-threatening ways of registering that you understand what someone else is saying. I'm sorry, that was the cat forwarding the slide. Try to understand someone else's point of view without necessarily agreeing to it. So we're going to practice ways to do this, but reflective listening is one technique. So you can say something like, you feel that I was, and finish the sentence. You feel that this meant, and finish the sentence. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with their perception. It means that you're trying to understand what they're saying. Many of us assume that others are trying to hurt us, and we often drive our interpretations of what they're trying to do out of our fear. We're afraid that they're going to do something. We're afraid that whatever it is we fear the most is what the other party intends to do. Again, realize that you have that perceptual bias and put a label on it so you can see that that's happening. It's possible you're right. It's very possible you're wrong. Emotions cloud our perception. It's easy for us to blame other people for our problems. It's not very helpful to do that. Even when there's some truth to it, it's not very helpful. It's much more useful to say, here's a problem, and to distinguish that from the person you're talking to. again, voicing someone else's perception can be extremely powerful to them, and don't miss an opportunity to treat it as important. Remember that everyone's viewpoint is important to them. And once you recognize that, it can give you a much better opportunity for negotiation if you're recognizing this is what's important to that person. Also, simply because something isn't important to you doesn't mean it's not important to someone else. Many of us fail to negotiate as effectively as we could because we simply don't value something very much. It means that we're not as likely to offer something that would be of value to someone else, but also that we're not likely to get as much out of a negotiation because we don't realize that this has a higher value to somebody else. Years ago, I sold a car, and I had I don't know what you call it, a cargo carrier that fit on top of that particular model of car. I had no use for that cargo carrier because I was selling the car and it was custom to that kind of car. It not only didn't have any value to me, it actually had negative value because it was just taking up space in my garage. When the person who bought my car was buying it, I said, "Oh, do you want this cargo carrier?" We had already reached an agreement on the price of the car and on everything else, so I was just basically giving him the cargo carrier. That's nice, that's fine, but look at the opportunity I missed. It turned out that that actually had a big value to him because he wanted to transport a lot of stuff using this car, and I really missed an opportunity to say, here's the car, and separately, if you're interested, I'm willing to negotiate about the cargo carrier. In Getting to Yes, the authors identify something similar, that the U.S. simply didn't consider the technology transfer issue during the Law of the Sea conference is very important, and they kept putting it aside of, oh yeah, that we can work that out later, not a big issue. Well, it wasn't a big issue to the U.S., it was a big issue to others, and that's really a missed opportunity. This next item that the authors identify for us is look for ways to send messages that differ from the party's perceptions. If, especially with someone with whom you may have a contentious relationship, if you start out with recognizing something good they've done, it actually creates a cognitive dissonance with them. They're expecting you to say something negative, and here you've said something positive. Look for ways of helping them get past their own biases. The best solution in the world isn't going to be worth anything unless everyone's willing to make it happen. And at the same time, when people don't participate in an agreement, they don't have ownership of it. They may not agree to it, or if they end up agreeing to it, they may not have any investment in making it successful. The more you feel that you're the author of something, the more you are likely to make sure that it gets effectuated. It's not effective for you to say, here's what the rule's going to be, the end. That's not as effective as saying, let's agree about what the rules should be, because then the other person literally gets buy-in. And in a way, it's almost childish when you're expecting someone else to simply obey your orders. It's almost as if you're dealing with a 4-year-old saying, no, we don't have cookies in between meals. That's the rule. It might work with the 4-year-old. I'll tell you, it won't work with a 14-year-old. But you're also depriving that child of the ability to start coming up with the basic principle. We don't want to get full on unhealthy items before meals. What rules can we come up that are consistent with that goal? Again, I'm not expecting people to get into heavy-duty conversations with 4-year-olds, but translate that same idea with others. If you understand what the overall goals are and agree about those overall goals and get people to buy in, not only will they be more likely to agree in the first place, they may come up with some great ideas you didn't think of. You don't have all the resources. You don't have all the solutions. Getting participation from more people earlier is likely to end up in a superior and more enforceable agreement. I think it's very interesting when managers hog the credit. It's such a dumb thing to do. It is free for you to give credit to people who work for you and to others in the other people, clients, to outsiders. That's free. It doesn't make you look smaller because you give other people credit for their participation in some project. It makes you look bigger. But just start watching. You'll see people hog credit and say, oh, this was all because me. This is me, 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 me. Not only is it extremely narcissistic and childish, you're missing an opportunity for other people to feel that their work's valued and for them to buy in, to work more constructively with you. So err on the side of generosity. Start with, I'd like to thank all these people for what they did, and identify what they did. Realize that the work of some people is kind of invisible, and whenever they do get some recognition for it, they can be enormously grateful. We take for granted the work of a lot of people, and even the smallest form of recognition can be very valuable to them. When I became graduate director many years ago, I sent a thank you letter to each professor who had been teaching in the program. Decades later, I'll get faculty saying, that letter you wrote me was so meaningful. No one's ever thanked me for working for the university. What did that cost me? I don't know, 20 minutes. What impact did it have? Huge. Give people some way to save face. You don't have to prove that you are the one who's right and you told them this before and they should have recognized it earlier. Be graceful. Give people a way that they can save face and change their minds. Most people view it as some sort of failure on their part to change their mind. It'd be nice if all of us could get past that idea. In fact, the strongest leaders are the ones who say, oh, thanks for showing me my mistake. Let's do something different. A lot of people can't do that. So help someone change their mind without having to admit that they're wrong. So saying something like, Jen was so nice to work on this, and of course the rules have changed since the last time she worked on it. Jen, thanks so much. It's a graceful way to do it. Realize that feelings might matter more than what people are saying. Fear can often breed anger. Next time you see somebody get angry, or that you get angry yourself, ask yourself, what's motivating this? Oftentimes it's just fear, and our response to that is to lash out. And at the same time, the more we get angry, it can make us more fearful. It's a really odd dynamic. The authors ask us to pay special attention to certain core concerns. People have a concern about power. We want some control over our own work, our own lives, and this is core to the identity of most of us. We want our work to be appreciated. We want to show that we're affiliated with something, a school, an employer, a group, and that we belong. Many of us with our identities want to be recognized for some sort of accomplishment. I'm a conscientious person. I am a smart person. I am a diligent employee. However someone's identity is defined, that's an important concern on their part. Many people are very driven by status, and if they feel they've been treated disrespectfully or in a way that doesn't recognize their status, you've lost them. Understand that people's own view of their self-image or respect is sometimes so important to them, it's hard to get past it. So treat people, even those with whom you disagree, respectfully. Identify someone else's emotions and acknowledge that they're legitimate. Everyone's problems are big to them. Think back, or think right now. Let's suppose that your niece is 6 years old and she hasn't been invited to a party that other people in her school or in her class at school are having. What's your first response? For most of us, it's to say, oh, that doesn't matter. You don't need to go to that party. You're not even friends with that girl, are you? What you're telling her is, you shouldn't feel the way you feel. You feel, well, how would you feel if you were 6 years old and you aren't invited to a party? You probably feel like you're not wanted, like you've been rejected. Someone else telling you not to feel that way isn't going to solve that feeling. It just makes you feel bad because someone else says you shouldn't feel the way you feel. That's not a solution. Think instead about identifying their emotion. How does that make you feel? What can we do so that you feel better? Let others recount their grievances. Don't dismiss them. Don't interrupt them. Don't tell them they shouldn't feel that way. Sometimes people need to get it off their chest. Let them. When people have emotional outbursts with you, it's difficult, but try not to respond emotionally. Try to step outside your body a little bit and say, this person is being emotional for some reason. It may be fear. It may be frustration. Try to be a little bit objective about it. But just because someone's being emotional and yelling at you, slamming things around, doesn't mean that you need to respond to that. In fact, withdrawing, if it doesn't seem like that's a good time to be talking to someone, simply withdraw. But you don't have to become emotional as well. That's how you can get really unfortunate emotional escalations that way. Use symbolic gestures to show that you are recognizing someone else's emotions. Again, even just the letter I wrote to faculty members cost me very little, had a big impact, and showed how much those people's work was really valued. Recognize that whatever it is you say, someone may hear something different. Sometimes people are just wondering if you're trying to enlist them to be on one side or another. Oftentimes when you're talking to people, they're not really listening to you at all. They're just thinking about waiting for you to finish so that they can say what they're going to say next. They're often resisting your message. Sometimes part of my job as a department chair is I get students in my office who have had some bad things happen academically, sometimes personally, and they're very resistant to hearing anything about it, and it's hard for them to hear. I'll sometimes even say, what did I just say? And they can't tell me what I just said. Why can't they tell me? Well, it's probably because they're not listening. Why aren't they listening? Because their mind is so full of what they think they want to try to get me to do that they can't hear anything. So try to calm down situations and make sure everyone's hearing what someone else is saying. Active listening means that you're demonstrating to someone else that you hear what they're saying. We're going to do an exercise related to this later. Recognize that you can understand what someone's saying without agreeing with someone's saying. So if you say something like, what you're saying is, you thought that it didn't have to be done until the 19th because we weren't making that presentation until the 20th. Am I understanding? You're not putting them on the spot, you're just trying to understand what they're saying. It also doesn't mean that you're agreeing with them. You're just trying to verify what they're saying. Try to speak so that you are simply trying to be understood. Blaming someone else, starting out with blaming, calling people's names. When you say, this is disrespectful of you, you're doing this, you're a jerk, how much do you think they're going to hear the rest of your message? You just shut them down right now. Maybe you feel good getting this off your chest, but you're becoming ineffective. Most of us attribute bad things to other people, not ourselves. we'll talk about how to gain a bit of maturity on that. But you'll be forget developing to be a more mature person. Just in simple negotiation outcomes, you will be more successful if you talk about yourself and not them. What do you want? What are you trying to get? Rather than saying, I know you don't want me to have this. I know you're trying to get me to pay more. I know you're putting them on the defensive. Talk about what you need, what you want, what your approach is. Prevention works best, the authors tell us, and they talk about building a working relationship. The authors gave you the example from Ben Franklin and pointed out that it's comfortable knowing that someone owes you a favor. That's interesting, however, and if you ever get a chance to read Ben Franklin's autobiography, do it. It's really a good book. He was actually trying to make a different point with that story. His point was, when someone has done you a favor, and in his example, he asked a political foe if he could borrow a book. When someone asks you a favor, you start feeling invested in them. Why is that? Because otherwise you have cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when, to your mind, it looks like there's conflicting things, and your mind is trying to resolve that conflict because it makes you uncomfortable. If you've decided someone isn't a good employee and then they do something really well, that creates cognitive dissonance, and you're trying to resolve how did that happen? Either that person really is a better employee than you thought, or how did they produce such a good product? Sometimes you even come up with other hypotheticals. Oh, she had someone else help her on that. Because you're trying to solve your cognitive dissonance. Ben Franklin observed that, and remember, this was at a time when books were rare and very expensive. If you ask your enemy for a favor, and your enemy does it for you, your enemy's going to have a hard time saying that you're a jerk, because you wouldn't do a favor for someone who was a jerk, right? Therefore, maybe he's not a jerk. So asking for someone who's not your friend for a favor means they're more likely, if they do that favor for you, to treat you as if you are a friend, because otherwise they don't know how to reconcile those apparently conflicting notions. When you look at a problem, look at that problem and not the people. And they give you an example in the book of literally being physically side by side with someone rather than across. Most of us, when we're negotiating with people and we're physically together, we're in the same room, we tend to be across from one another. Even physically getting next to someone makes it a little bit more constructive. This isn't something you'd want to do all the time, but just realize the more you approach that both literally and figuratively as we're on the same team, what can we make work, the more likely you will be to be successful.